The contractor stood on my front porch holding a heavy clipboard and wearing steel-toed boots that were currently tracking mud onto my welcome mat. He did not ask for me. He asked for Gary. I told him Gary was at work and asked what this was about. The man tapped his pen against the clipboard and announced he was here to measure the kitchen for the custom granite countertops Gary ordered last Tuesday. I stared at the man. I told him I owned this house and I absolutely did not order granite countertops. The contractor chuckled, shaking his head. He said Gary warned him the tenant upstairs might get a little confused and territorial. The contractor then looked me dead in the eye and said Gary told him I was just renting the spare bedroom to get back on my feet. The blood roared in my ears. I ordered the contractor off my property. I watched him drive away, my mind spinning as the sheer magnitude of what I had just heard began to process. Gary was my best friend of 30 years. We worked together at the old lumber yard in our 20s. I knew his parents. I stood as his best man. When his wife Susan threw him out a year ago after discovering his hidden credit card debt, I did not hesitate. I cleared out my finished basement, handed him a spare key, and told him he could stay until he saved enough for an apartment. I asked for zero rent. I only asked that he buy his own groceries and help with the lawn. Now, a stranger was standing on my porch, claiming my lifelong friend was the homeowner and I was a charity case renting a room. I did not call Gary. Confronting a liar without all the facts is a fool's errand. I needed to know exactly how deep this delusion ran before I burned the bridge to the ground. I walked back inside and locked the door. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight down the hallway to the basement door. I rarely went down there. I respected privacy. But the rules of privacy vanish the second a man tries to claim another man's castle. I flipped the switch and marched down the wooden stairs. Gary had made himself incredibly comfortable. He brought in a massive leather sectional, a widescreen television, and set up a small office area in the corner. I walked over to the desk. I am not a snooper by nature, but survival instincts kicked in. I opened the top drawer. Right on top of a stack of car magazines was a manila folder labeled with my home address. I flipped it open. Inside was a professionally printed document titled Residential Lease Agreement. I read the first line and felt a cold fury settle in my chest. Gary had typed up a fake lease. It listed him as the landlord and me as the tenant. He forged my signature at the bottom. The document stated I was paying him $600 a month for access to the upper level of the home. I shoved the folder back into the drawer and kept digging. Next, I found a stack of mail. Most of my mail goes to a P.O. box I have maintained since the 90s, but utility bills and neighborhood association letters come to the house. I realized I had not seen an HOA newsletter in months. Gary had intercepted them. I found them stacked neatly in his bottom drawer. He had been opening mail addressed to current resident and filling out the community surveys in his own name. The picture was becoming clear, but I needed to know the public extent of this charade. I left the house and drove down to Oakwood Hardware, the local supply store we both frequented for decades. I walked up to the counter where Bob, the owner, was organizing receipts. Bob looked up and smiled. He asked how the new deck was coming along. I kept my face entirely neutral. I told him I had not started a new deck. Bob looked confused. He said Gary was in the shop 3 days ago pricing out treated lumber and structural supports. Bob laughed and said Gary complained about how hard it was to maintain a property with a deadbeat tenant living upstairs who refused to help with the manual labor. I placed my hands flat on the counter. I looked Bob straight in the eye and told him I own the house. I told him Gary has been sleeping in my basement for 12 months because his wife divorced him. I told him Gary does not own a single square inch of property in this county. Bob went pale. He stood frozen holding a stack of receipts. He apologized profusely, saying Gary had been coming in for months buying small fixtures, paint, and cabinet hardware, always talking about his renovation plans. Gary had established an entire reputation in town as a generous homeowner helping out a struggling buddy. I left the hardware store and drove to the neighborhood community center. Our HOA president, Margaret, is a sharp woman who misses nothing. I knocked on the glass door of her office. She welcomed me in, though she looked slightly surprised to see me. I sat down across from her desk and asked what Gary had been telling her. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She admitted Gary had submitted an application to join the neighborhood planning committee. On the application, he listed my address as his primary residence. When Margaret questioned him about my status, Gary told her a tragic story. He claimed I lost my pension in a bad investment, nearly lost the house to foreclosure, and that he bought the property out from under the bank to save me from homelessness. He told Margaret he was letting me stay out of the goodness of his heart. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Gary had not just stolen my house in his mind, he had stolen my dignity to elevate his own social status. He weaponized my quiet, private nature. Because I did not attend every block party or gossip at the local diner, Gary had a blank canvas to paint his masterpiece of deception. I thanked Margaret for her time. I told her the absolute truth. I told her I own my home free and clear. I told her Gary is a guest who has overstayed his welcome. Margaret was furious on my behalf. She offered to call the committee and strike his name from the record immediately. I told her to wait. I told her the annual neighborhood summer potluck was scheduled for this Saturday, just 2 days away. I told her I wanted Gary to attend, and I wanted to be on the schedule to speak. For the next 48 hours, I played the part. Gary came home from his job at the dealership, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and clapped me on the shoulder. He asked how my day was. He complained about his boss. He acted like the same old friend I had known for 30 years. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to drag him out by his collar right then. I nodded, drank my coffee, and watched him head down to the basement. Saturday arrived. The community center parking lot was packed. The neighborhood potluck is the social event of the year for Oakwood Estates. Everyone attends. Bob from the hardware store was there. Margaret was at the front table. Gary walked in beside me, carrying a tray of store-bought brownies, greeting people left and right like he was the mayor. He shook hands, slapped backs, and pointed out small improvements he planned to make to his property this fall. I let him enjoy the spotlight for exactly 1 hour. I ate my brisket. I drank my iced tea. I watched the man I called a brother spin a web of lies to people I respected. At 7 o'clock, Margaret tapped a spoon against her glass. The room quieted down. She welcomed everyone to the annual dinner and thanked the volunteers. Then, she announced that a longtime resident had a few words to share about neighborhood integrity. She handed the microphone to me. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I carried a brown leather portfolio under my arm. Gary was sitting at a table near the front, smiling, totally unaware of the freight train heading his way. I looked at the crowd. I saw Bob. I saw Margaret. I saw neighbors I had waved to for 20 years. I spoke clearly into the microphone. I thanked Margaret for the introduction. I stated that community is built on trust, honesty, and knowing exactly who your neighbors are. I opened my portfolio. I pulled out a thick stack of papers. I announced to the room that there seemed to be a terrible misunderstanding circulating through Oakwood Estates. I said a rumor had been spread that I lost my pension, faced foreclosure, and was currently renting a room in my own home from a generous benefactor. The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. I looked directly at Gary. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of sheer panic. He started to stand up, but I raised my hand and pointed directly at his chest. I told him to sit down. The command cracked like a whip through the silent room. Gary sank back into his folding chair. I held up the first document. I stated this was the original deed to my house, signed and filed in 1995. I held up the second document. I stated this was a letter from my bank proving my mortgage was paid off in full 5 years ago. I held up the third document. I stated this was my current property tax receipt, paid in full, in my name. Then, I pulled out the manila folder I took from the basement. I told the crowd that a true friend helps you in a time of need. I explained that when Gary's wife threw him out a year ago for hiding tens of thousands of dollars in secret debt, I gave him a place to sleep. I gave him my basement for free. I asked for nothing in return. I held up the fake lease agreement. I explained exactly what it was. I explained how Gary forged my signature, intercepted my mail, and hired a contractor to tear down a wall in a house he did not own. I explained how he lied to Bob at the hardware store, how he lied to Margaret at the HOA, and how he lied to every single person in this room to stroke his own shattered ego. Gary was pale and sweating. He looked around the room, desperate for an ally. There were none. The faces staring back at him were filled with disgust and judgment. The people he had tried to impress now saw him for exactly what he was, a pathetic fraud. Gary finally found his voice. He tried to laugh it off. He waved his hands and claimed it was just a big misunderstanding, a joke that got out of hand. He said I was taking things too seriously. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I spoke directly into the microphone with absolute authority. I told Gary the joke was over. I told him he had exactly 1 hour to return to my house, pack every single item he owned into his truck, and leave my property forever. I stated that if his truck was not gone by 8:30, I would throw his belongings onto the lawn and let the sprinklers do the rest. I handed the microphone back to Margaret. I walked down the center aisle of the room. People parted for me. Nobody spoke to Gary. As I reached the door, I heard the scrape of his chair as he scrambled to follow me out. I drove home and parked in my driveway. I stood on the porch and waited. 10 minutes later, Gary's truck screeched to a halt at the curb. He jumped out, his face red with anger and humiliation. He marched up the walkway and demanded to know why I had to do that in front of everyone. He accused me of humiliating him. I stepped down from the porch to meet him on the grass. I told him he humiliated himself the day he decided my generosity was a weakness he could exploit. I told him he had 45 minutes left. Gary tried a different tactic. He tried to play the victim. He brought up our 30 years of friendship. He reminded me of the time he helped me fix my roof in the late 90s. He said he was just trying to feel like a man again after his divorce tore him down. He said he lied because he was embarrassed to be living in a basement at his age. I felt absolutely zero pity. A man's pride is his own responsibility. You do not rebuild your pride by stealing another man's life. I told Gary that his embarrassment did not justify forgery, deception, and betrayal. I told him the clock was ticking. Gary realized I was an immovable object. The facade finally cracked completely. He cursed at me, a bitter, venomous string of insults. He stormed past me and headed down the exterior stairs to the basement entrance. I did not follow him down. I stood in my kitchen, listening to the frantic sounds of banging and crashing beneath my feet. I heard drawers slamming. I heard boxes being dragged across the concrete floor. I stood by the window and watched him haul his life out of my house load by load. He threw his clothes into the bed of his truck in trash bags. He dragged his television up the stairs, the cord trailing behind him in the dirt. He did not bother taking the heavy leather sectional. At exactly 8:15, Gary slammed the tailgate of his truck shut. He stood by the driver's side door, chest heaving. He looked up at the kitchen window where I was standing. He did not say a word. He got into his truck, started the engine, and drove away. He did not look back. I walked down to the basement. It was a disaster. Trash bags were torn open, empty beer cans littered the desk, and the fake lease agreement was torn to shreds on the floor. I did not care. The basement could be cleaned. The infection was gone. The first thing I did was call a 24-hour locksmith. He arrived within the hour and changed the deadbolts on every exterior door of the house. I paid him in cash and locked the door behind him. The heavy click of the new deadbolt was the most satisfying sound I had heard in a year. The next morning, the neighborhood was quiet. I walked out to my driveway to pick up the morning paper. Bob from the hardware store drove by in his pickup. He slowed down, rolled down his window, and gave me a respectful nod. I nodded back. Later that afternoon, a crew from a junk removal service arrived. I paid them to haul away the leather sectional, the desk, and the remaining trash Gary had left behind in his panicked exit. I watched them carry the heavy furniture up the stairs and toss it into the back of their dump truck. With every piece that left the house, the air felt lighter. I spent the rest of the week painting the basement. I rolled fresh, clean white paint over the walls, erasing every trace of the last 12 months. I tore up the old carpet he had ruined and exposed the bare concrete beneath. I reclaimed my space, inch by inch. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail from the Granite Countertop Company. It was an invoice addressed to Gary, demanding a cancellation fee for the aborted installation. I took a thick black marker, wrote, "Return to sender, fraudulent address," across the envelope, and dropped it back in the mailbox. I never saw Gary again. I heard through the grapevine that he moved 2 towns over and rented a small apartment above a laundromat. I heard he tried to tell people there that he left Oakwood Estates because the neighborhood went downhill. I did not care what he told them. His lies were no longer my problem. I learned a hard lesson about boundaries. Generosity is a virtue, but unregulated generosity is an invitation for parasites. I offered a man a life raft, and he tried to steal the whole ship. I will never make that mistake again. My house is my sanctuary. The doors are locked, the title is clear, and the only name on the deed is mine.